Barry assumed that the purpose of these two doorways was to give the crew access to other parts of the ship, and when the time came for him to finally leave the bridge, he would discover that he was correct in this assumption. As he continued looking around the room, he noticed that there was another doorway which, if you were stood with your back to the view screen, was located on your right side. And when Barry eventually got round to checking out this other doorway, he would decide that the room behind the door must have been used by the captain as his ready room. In the meantime, having made the decision to leave inspecting this doorway until later, the next thing he noticed was a large chair with a high back located towards the rear and middle of the room. This chair was deep red in colour and was covered in a material that at first glance Barry did not recognise, but thought it could possibly be some kind of artificial leather. With his eyes now fully adjusted to the dim light of the room, he made his way over to the chair, and on reaching the chair, he could not resist the temptation to run his hand over its seat, and was surprised at how soft it was to the touch, compared to anything else he had experienced before. Once seated and remembering what he had seen on many of the science fiction shows he had watched over the years, he checked out the chair for control switches, and to his delight he found that each of the chair's arms had several switches built in, some of which Barry assumed were for the captain to communicate with other parts of the ship. As for the others, he assumed some were for the captain's personal recording devices, something like he had seen in an old episode of the cult TV series Star Trek, which despite its age was still being shown on television networks around the room and was still as popular as ever, and the rest of the switches he assumed were for controlling other functions of the ship. Directly in front of this chair was a raised platform with a further bank of switches and dials, as well as 3 chairs spaced at equal distance across the platform. This platform ran almost the full width of the bridge, and Barry assumed it had to be the main control unit, which the crew would have used to fly the ship when it was in manual mode. And as he thought about this, he noticed that an image of Lucy had now appeared on the large view screen at the front of the room, and so he asked her if he was correct in this assumption, to which she said he was. As Barry looked at the empty chairs behind this control panel, the thought suddenly struck him, who was flying the ship? And when he asked Lucy this question, she said she was, and that all the other ship's systems were under her control as well. She went on to say that, of course, if he so wished, he could fly the ship in manual mode and she would teach him how to do this. But as it required 3 other crew members, as well as himself, to fly the ship in manual mode, it was best if she continued flying the ship herself. Adding that, of course, should he think it necessary, he could still make changes to how the ship was being flown by the use of voice control. After a few minutes of taking in all this information, Barry asked Lucy if there was any other method of interfacing with her other than the image which was currently being displayed on the large view screen. And in answer to his question, Lucy confirmed that there were 2 other methods of interfacing with her other than the method she was currently using, these being a holographic image system, or if he wanted something more solid, she could create an Android version of herself. After thinking about it for a few moments, Barry decided to try out the holographic system first, and so he asked Lucy to produce one for him, and seconds later, a holographic image of a young woman suddenly appeared standing between the viewing screen at the front of the room and the raised platform in front of the chair. And at the same time as this holographic image appeared, the image of Lucy on the view screen disappeared. As Barry sat there studying this holographic image, he was very pleased, while at the same time somewhat surprised to note that this image was a perfect match to his memory of how his Lucy had looked the last time he had seen her almost 34 years ago. Just like his Lucy, this holographic image was approximately 178 centimeters tall, or as the saying goes, 5 feet 10 inches tall in old money. Also, like his Lucy, this holographic image had long blonde hair, which was in the style of pigtails, and each of these pigtails were held in place with a single blue ribbon. And even though Lucy usually wore her hair in this style, she would occasionally, depending on her mood at the time, wear it in either a ponytail held in place by a large bow, which was usually red, or she would simply let it hang loose. As Barry looked at the image more closely, he noticed that it had those same blue-green eyes, as well as that same slim hourglass figure, which he remembered so well, and it even had the same red freckles which ran in a thin line just below her eyes. As well as looking like his Lucy, the image was also dressed the same way as she had been the last time he saw her, in that the image was wearing a dark blue miniskirt, a white top with short sleeves, which he had bought her for her birthday, a pair of flat-heeled peep-toe black shoes, along with a 3/4 length green woolen coat. As he stood there looking at this image, that warm feeling which he always seemed to get whenever he was in Lucy's presence came over him. And for a moment it was like he was back there in his kitchen, watching her wave goodbye to him as she walked out the front door, and for a brief moment he thought he was going to break down and cry. However, Barry quickly pulled himself together and asked Lucy if she controlled all the ship's functions like she said she did, then did this mean he was the only living person on board? To which she replied that if by living persons he meant persons who were capable of independent thought, then yes, he was the only living person on board. Barry thought about this for a moment and, shaking his head, said, "But surely there has to be someone else on board, otherwise how does all the physical tasks get done?" In answer to his question, Lucy said, as if she was trying to explain something to a young child, "As I have already said, if the situation required it, I am quite capable of creating an android version of myself to carry out such tasks. However, this is not necessary because there are already a number of androids on board, and it is their job to carry out such tasks." "I see," said Barry, and was about to make a further comment when Lucy went on to add, in that same schoolteacher manner, that because these androids were incapable of independent thought and could only carry out those instructions given to them, then by his own definition the fact remains that he is the only living person on board. After a moment's pause, he said that he had to admit he could not find any fault with her logic. Nonetheless, this last remark only served to remind him that no matter which way you looked at it, he was no longer human in any true sense of the word. But Barry, being Barry, he quickly put this thought out of his mind and started to think about all the possible advantages that came with having an android body, and so he asked Lucy to tell him in greater detail about his new body's capabilities. In reply, Lucy started by explaining how his body had 4 different methods of viewing the world around him. The first of these, of course, was his eyes, just like when he was a flesh and blood human. However, as he was aware, his new eyes did not have the same fault as his old eyes did. As well as operating in normal mode, these eyes were also capable of operating in 3 other modes. The first of which was X-ray vision, which when activated allowed him to see through most objects. Although the denser the object was, the poorer the quality of the image would be. Therefore, this mode of vision had its limitations. The second operating mode was infrared, which when activated allowed him to track a given object by the heat given off by that object. But of course, the drawback to this mode of vision was that he could easily get confused if another object close by was giving off a significantly higher heat signature than the intended target. The third operating mode was his telescopic vision, at which Barry interrupted her with a laugh, saying, "You mean I have zoom capability?" And as Lucy had not yet developed a sense of humour, she failed to get his joke, and so she simply said, "That is correct." Next, Lucy went on to explain how he could switch between his normal vision and his 3 other types of vision. But Barry, who was still chuckling at the thought of having a zoom capability, missed this explanation, and so he had to ask her to repeat what she had just said. And of course, instead of saying, "Were you not listening? I have just told you to change between your normal vision and each of your other viewing systems, like you or I might have done," she simply repeated her explanation of how to access these other viewing systems. She explained that there were 2 methods of switching between his normal vision and his 3 other viewing systems, and the first of these was by thought control, in that all he had to do was just think about which system he wanted to use. And the second method, which took a bit more practice, was by blinking his eyelids, which was to blink once for X-ray, twice for infrared, or 3 times to use what Barry called his zoom capability. Adding that, however, the blink system only worked with his extra systems. So to return back to his normal vision, he had to use thought control and say in his mind, "Return to normal vision," or something similar. Nodding, Barry said, "I see. However, I should point out that this second method could be a problem, because us humans are known to blink quite regular without thinking about it." And in response, Lucy said that she had already anticipated this problem when it had first become apparent that she needed to transfer his consciousness into an android body. And so with this in mind, she had upgraded many of this android body's capabilities, including the Sight operating system. Therefore, as a result of these upgrades, this android body, unlike his old human body, did not blink unless he wished it to. As Barry digested this new batch of information, especially the part about having a zoom capability, all sorts of ideas went through his mind as to what these upgrades could be. And as he did so, he had visions of laser beams shooting out of his eyes, and for a moment he could see himself jumping over tall buildings just like Superman. That was until he realised that Lucy had moved on and was explaining to him about the skeleton structure of his new android body. She told him that it consisted of an almost indestructible inner core, which was made from an alloy called brackish, which naturally Barry had never heard of, which of course was not surprising considering that apart from germane, this alloy only exists on a handful of planets across the known universe. Lucy went on to say that this inner skeleton structure was covered by a strong sponge-like material called almog, and the purpose of this material was to simulate muscle. On top of the almog was another layer of material called deferon, and this layer is similar to the dermis in the human body. On top of this layer of deferon are a set of thin tubes surrounded by sponge gel-like substance called plaquedan, and running through this plaquedan for the entire length of the body are several thin tubes called broxide tube, made from a material called stone gaff. And running through these tubes is a warm red liquid called pinsin. And the purpose of this pinsin is to simulate blood, so as to further reinforce the illusion that this person is human. Lucy next said that on top of the plaquedan layer was an outer layer of a material called Savcar, which gave protection to the plaquedan layer and simulated skin. And what was really special about Savcar was that Barry was able to change its colour, texture and shape, all without the need of any shape-changing surgery. Lucy further explained that, like his vision system, he was able to achieve this transformation of the outer layer by the power of his mind, thus giving him the ability to be able to resemble any known species that he may wish to impersonate. That way, when the occasion required it, he could move among them without being noticed. And to further reinforce his ability, he was also able to control the temperature of the pincen so as to match the skin temperature of any particular species he was trying to impersonate at the time. And again, this was achieved simply by the use of his thoughts. As Lucy paused in her description of the different layers of this android body, Barry stood there speechless until, with a shake of his head, he once again said, "You've got to be kidding me." And once again, in reply, Lucy said, "No, I am not." As Barry thought over what Lucy had just said with regards to thought control, it suddenly dawned on him that according to her, he no longer had a brain. So how was this thought control possible? And when he asked Lucy this question, she said that although he no longer had an organic brain, he did have an electronic brain which worked in the same way, except that his electronic brain worked a lot faster and he held a lot more information. Also, unlike his organic brain, his electronic brain could link with the ship's computer and use it as a backup. Lucy went on to say that another advantage of having an electronic brain was that it did not require oxygen to maintain its function. So therefore, he was not reliant on there always being an oxygen-type atmosphere wherever he went. As Lucy explained this to Barry, he could not help but notice how pink and smooth his hands looked, which in turn made him think that apart from giving colour to the outer layer of Savkar, if it did not have to carry oxygen to the brain, then what other purpose could this pinsar possibly serve? So he asked Lucy about this, and in reply she said that the pinsar was there to give the illusion of real skin, and to achieve this illusion, when it passed through his artificial heart known as the pumping bag, it was heated or cooled to whatever temperature was required. Then as it passed around the body, the Savkar would warm up or cool down accordingly, thus further giving the impression that he was whatever living being he was trying to impersonate. As if she had anticipated his next question, Lucy went on to say that the pumping bag was located in a small cavity in the same place in the body as his old human heart would have been. "I see," said Barry, who was finally starting to come to terms with the fact that he was no longer truly human. But nonetheless, whenever she referred to him in such terms, it still rankled him. So he told her that she had to stop comparing his new body to his old human body and just simply give him the facts. So she went on to tell him that among the many things that she had discovered when she probed his consciousness was just how much he loved his food. And so even though he no longer needed to consume food as a source of fuel to maintain the body's functions, she had nonetheless still added a cavity to simulate the stomach, and this cavity was connected to his mouth by a flexible tube of almog. Also, as well as the simulated stomach, she had added to the back of the mouth what he called taste buds, so he could still enjoy his food like he had always done. The thought of still being able to eat made Barry smile, and of course she was right, and he did indeed love his food. And before he could say, "Is that all?" she went on to say that, like his heart, the stomach was in the same place as it had been in his human body. Barry's next question was, if he did not need to consume food as a fuel source, then how was this body powered? To which Lucy said that the body was powered by an internal power generator similar to a nuclear power generator found on Earth, but without the same damaging side effect. Lucy said that this power generator was a type of solid green crystal called plutonium, and unlike nuclear power, these crystals have an almost unlimited lifespan owing to the fact that they can recharge themselves from the background radiation found in abundance all over the universe. Then, to Barry's surprise, Lucy went on to explain a feature of this body which he was not expecting, and that was that when interacting with a human-type female of compatible species, he could still be capable of producing another biological life form. And when she dropped this bombshell, as you can imagine, it left him gobsmacked, as they say. And before he could ask Lucy how was this possible, she went on to explain the reason for adding this particular feature, and it was that after studying the human race, she had concluded that this act of reproduction was very important to the well-being of the human psyche. However, she did not bother to elaborate on exactly how this feature had been achieved, only that this body had all the same features and reproduction abilities of the human male. And when she added that this feature was also controlled by his thoughts, Barry could not help but smile as he thought to himself, God and Bennett, whatever next? As Barry continued thinking about this unexpected feature, he started whistling to himself as he started to remember the many happy times he had experienced with the ladies back in his youth. And no doubt, had he still been human, he would have blushed. However, after several seconds of this journey down memory lane, he quickly pulled himself together and asked Lucy if she had any other surprises for him. Not really understanding what he meant by surprises, she simply went on to explain that as well as the features she had already described, he now had a greater sense of hearing. And for a brief moment, Barry was tempted to say, "What?" But knowing that at this stage he lacked a sense of humour, he decided against it. Having completed her description of his new body and its features, she went on to say that although his body was almost indestructible, the Mimitak elders had taken into account the possibility that there might come a time when he needed even greater protection. So they had designed 3 personal protection systems, which consisted of a personal shield, a personal cloaking system, and a personal weapons system. And these systems were built into a special suit. I see, said Barry, nodding as he once again started to see himself as some kind of superhero. First, Lucy explained about his personal shield, telling him that when first turned on, it would form an impregnable, invisible barrier approximately 2 centimeters out from the suit, although it was possible to extend this up to several meters if the situation required it. But she quickly added that the downside of this extension was that the further the shield extended out from the suit, the weaker the field became, and so gave less protection. Lucy went on to say that with this in mind, it was recommended that the shield should not be extended to no more than 6 meters outwards from the suit, as within this range no weapon or energy source known to exist at this time was capable of penetrating the shield. However, beyond that distance, it was uncertain as to how effective the shield would be. Also, once activated, the shield was like an anchor, as while Barry stood still, nothing could move it or him from outside the field. However, when he moved, the shield moved with him automatically. The second protection device was a personal cloak, which when activated, rendered him invisible to all around him, both visually and by all known types of electronic monitoring devices. Of course, this device also had its downside in that when activated, Barry could only view the world around him in colours that were of a paler version of those you would see in the normal world. Lucy went on to add that over time he would learn to compensate for this shift in the colour spectrum and would be able to view his surroundings much as he did when the cloak was not active. Lucy then added that the shield and the cloak could not be activated by his thoughts but had to be turned on by one of the control switches found on a belt he wore over the suit. Of course, if he was unable to use the switches, he could get Lucy to turn them on or off by remote control. Lucy next explained that his third personal protection system was a personal weapons system which consisted of two different systems. The first of which was a small laser type weapon which was concealed just under his right wrist, and so when the weapon was fired it would appear to an observer as if the laser beam had come directly from Barry's hand, giving the impression to anyone observing this that Barry had some kind of superpower. Of course, he had to take great care when using this laser, because if he did not, he might shoot off his own hand. So it was only to be used when, for whatever reason, he could not use his normal weapons. The second of these systems was a device concealed just under his left wrist, and which, when activated, sent out a shockwave which could be powerful enough to knock the person on the receiving end off their feet, or if aimed at an object, it could even destroy the target completely, depending on the pressure which the system had been set to by Barry at the time. Barry was just about to say that he could not wait to try on this suit when the thought struck him that although he was looking forward to meeting all these different species, how would he be able to communicate with them if they did not speak his language? And when he asked Lucy this question, she told him that his brain had a built-in translation system, so when he met a species he did not speak their language, the system would automatically translate the sound coming out of his mouth into the language of the species he was attempting to communicate with. And naturally, the system worked the other way around, and he would hear what the other person was saying in English, thus making communication between himself and the other species possible. She went on to say that the system also had the ability to quickly learn the language of any unknown species after only being exposed to it for a short period of time. And so if Barry was to meet a species which he had not come across before, then the system would quickly enable him to communicate with that species after hearing just a few short sentences. Lastly, Lucy went on to say that if he found himself in a situation whereby he could not speak to her openly, then he had the ability to communicate with her wirelessly, and this ability was possible both on and off the ship, with the advantage that his enemies would remain unaware of what he was doing, as he commanded the ship to his own advantage. She went on to say that, like the shield and cloak, this type of communication had its downside in that the further away from the ship he was, the longer it took to communicate with her, and vice versa. Lucy quickly added that although this form of contact with the ship did indeed have its downside, it also had its upside as well, in that not only did he have the ability to access and remotely control any of the ship's systems, but he could, should the situation require it, access and control systems of any of the ship's shuttlecraft and fly them remotely. That's interesting, thought Barry, as Lucy went on to warn him that he had to start this type of communication with the phrase, "Lucy, listen." Otherwise, she would assume that he had activated his wireless system by accident and so would disregard it. Barry started laughing at Lucy's last remark and said, "It's a good job that none of my old girlfriends ever had your ability to read my mind, Lucy. I mean, I would never have got away with all those things and cheap chat-up lines that I used to use." At this comment, Lucy pointed out that she could not read his mind, as he put it, but could only link with him wirelessly, which was not the same thing. "Well, that's a relief," said Barry, laughing. And even though Lucy was still learning about the human sense of humour, she nonetheless had started to understand when Barry was trying to use it. And also she had learnt that smiling was the response he expected to get from her. Thus she simply responded to his comments with a smile, and on seeing her smile, Barry thought that one day he would have to teach her how to laugh as well as smile. Even with all this information in his head, Barry still had lots more questions that he needed answers to, but he decided that for now these questions would have to wait. So instead, he spent the next 15 to 20 minutes trying out the many different features of this new android body. And in fact, you could say he was just like a kid in a candy shop. And so much so that at one point he got a bit carried away and put a large hole in the back of one of the 3 chairs in front of him while trying out the laser gun. And Lucy, seeing the guilty look on his face, smiled and said he was not to worry, as she would instruct one of the maintenance androids to replace it. It was at this point that Barry's curiosity once again kicked in, and so he turned to Lucy and asked her to explain to him in greater detail the series of events which had led up to this moment, and why he now found himself heading at breakneck speed towards the planet which she called Jumaine. So after spending a few seconds thinking about the different questions which Barry had asked her, she went on to say, well, it all started many thousands of years ago in a distant galaxy on a dying planet known to its people as Tamaron. Right, folks, that's the end of chapter 2. I hope you've enjoyed it so far. I'd be grateful if you would let me know in the comments below. Did you prefer the full chapter to be read in one go, like in chapter 1? Or did you find it better if I split the chapter into 2 sections like I did with chapter 2? And then that'll help me to decide which way to go with the future chapters. Also, if you're new to the channel, and especially if you like cruising, why not join? As I'm going on another cruise in a few days' time. It's the Christmas cruise. It's the 15th to the 22nd of December 2023. I've added the date because people obviously might be looking at this next year and thinking, what's he talking about? Okay, so that's it for now, folks, and I'll see you on the cruise. Bye for now. Bye.